when I started working on this back in the early 90s, I had just gotten out of law school. My last year of law school, I met a guy from Ecuador, a student, whose father was also from Ecuador, living in Massachusetts, and they were telling me about this situation down there where they described it as like one of the worst pollutions in the world. Not an accident, done deliberately by Texaco, American Oil Company, in this pristine ecosystem where indigenous peoples had been living for, thousands of years, living off the forest. And they're like, we got to do something about this. At least go down there and see what happened. See if we can build some sort of legal case out of it. I mean, what lawyers do generally is they're trained to find lawsuits or practice law, defending lawsuits. And it interested me because I'm a public interest guy, I'm an environmentalist, and I like to help people. That's why I went to law school. So we organized a mission of roughly 15 people on that first trip, got funding. And it was a combination of law students, lawyers, and doctors and public health people. And the goal of the mission was to investigate what had actually happened. And the lawyers were talking to witnesses and taking testimonies from, indigenous peoples and others in the Amazon. And the doctors were sort of doing medical tests and doing water tests of like rivers and streams that people were drinking out of that were near these oil wells and all this oil pollution. The upshot is what we saw was really an apocalyptic disaster. It's the only way I can describe it. I mean, I expected to see pollution, but this was so much worse than anything I ever could have imagined. It really made me question my whole concept of humanity, of the human condition. Like, I could not imagine human beings would design this kind of system.
What kinds of things did you see?
Well, the first thing you notice, and this is a large area of the Amazon, it's about 1,500 square miles in size. And that was the area of the concession. That's the area that Texaco paid Ecuador's government to drill in, to look for oil in, back in the 1960s. And they discovered oil in this area and then built a bunch of well sites and produced oil out of this area for roughly 25 years until the early 1990s. And by the time they left in 1992, they had gouged about 1,000 waste pits out of the jungle floor that were unlined.
Waste pits?
Oil waste pits. And what they had done is when they drilled a well in the jungle, they would clear like the forest is very thick. They would clear out the forest around the well site. And they would, bring in heavy equipment and sort of drill into the earth thousands of feet.
Thousands of feet?
Thousands of feet. And the process of drilling into the earth is a very violent process, which has cultural and other implications for the indigenous people, which I'll get to in a second. Okay. But bottom line is what comes out of these holes that go thousands of feet down is what's called drilling muds. That's an industry term. And drilling muds consist of rock and all sorts of chemicals, usually carcinogenic chemicals that the oil company puts in the hole to lubricate it to make the drilling process easier. And also there's natural heavy metals in the earth that come out. Mm. And this is all waste. It's very harmful to human health and to the environment and to animal health. And the question is, where do you put it? And normally you dispose of it properly. But Texaco, because they treated the Amazon thinking, they would never be held accountable, they treated it like it was basically a garbage dump.
And Texaco was later bought by Chevron,
exactly.
Just for people following at home.
Exactly. Yeah. Texaco, now Chevron.
Right.
They would kind of dig these pits out of the jungle and just dump the drilling muds into these pits. And so when I got there that first trip, I saw like what looked like lakes of oil waste. It looks like oil or thick oil or kind of crusted oil in these open air pits. And when you get near them, they stink. The vapors it's hot there. The sun's out. Vapors are coming up off the ground. And the worst part is the pits were unlined, so it was all leaking into the soil and groundwater. And they also, for many of the pits, built pipes that they stuck into the sides of them to run the contents of the pits, that is the cancer-producing oil waste, out of the pits into nearby streams and rivers
So it goes everywhere.
that the people were drinking out of. They basically took these pits, and rather than disposing of the waste properly, and also in the Amazon, it rains a lot. So they need, the pits would overflow, and they put the pipes in to sort of drain them out. They essentially created a system that ended up poisoning the water supply of thousands of people who were drinking out of these rivers and streams. Not just the water supply, but the food supply, because people would fish out of these rivers for their sustenance. And they would also bathe in the rivers. I mean, it was their environment was their food and their medicine, their livelihood, provided their shelter, to build houses and stuff. So what was really the worst thing about this was to really see it with my own eyes and see how extensive it was. I mean, there were literally hundreds of these pits with pipes polluting streams and rivers all over this region.
When they came down to initially do this, what years did you say that was again? Like the 70s, something like that?
They started they signed the agreement to go into this area in 1964. They drilled their first well in 1967 in a place now called Lago Agrio, Ecuador. And then they really built this system in earnest through the 70s and I'd say up to the mid-80s. And then they left in 1992.
Were they doing this on lands that quite literally some of the indigenous tribes are living on? Meaning like they're drilling a hole next door right here and I'm sitting, in the middle of my community watching them do this. Was it that close or was it a little bit out in the woods so maybe they didn't realize the extent of what was happening there? Like
It was all done on indigenous land, every last well. And let me explain what that means, okay? Because the forest is vast and you could be in the forest as an outsider or even fly over it and not see a single person. I mean, it's very, because the trees, the canopy, there are some villages, but even then it's hard to really, people lived like a very natural lifestyle based off of the environment. I mean, there were no roads or anything like that. The roads did not really get built until Texaco arrived in the 1960s and had to build the roads in order to create the production apparatus to extract oil. So all of these wells were built on indigenous territory. They were all done without asking the permission of the indigenous peoples or without sort of offering them any benefit, any of the revenue, not that they would want it because they lived a completely, non-monetary existence. I mean, they didn't have money as we understand money. But by the way, that didn't mean they weren't wealthy. They were very wealthy. Their wealth was not quantified by how we do it up here in the United States.
It's not modern
North.
society.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it was all in indigenous territory. The first well was built in what's now called Lago Agrio, which is really the territory of the Kofan indigenous group.
Yeah, we have that map. Yeah. Alessi has that up on the screen right there. So that's an interesting map. Those are all the different oil fields in the concession area. So remember I said it was 1,500 square miles in that large area, which is represented by the outline of that, kind of squiggly box, are different oil fields. And Lago Agrio at the top was the first field that they developed. And I'm looking at the scale of the map here. The bottom right corner shows the size of what is 20 kilometers. These are huge.
Huge.
This is far more than a mile across.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is many miles. I mean, I'd say it's from the bottom to the top is probably 100 miles, maybe 50 miles. I don't really know, but
maybe more even.
Maybe more. Yeah. It's big area, and it's thousands of people live in this area. I mean, when they first went there were fewer people. And what ended up happening is as the roads were built for the oil development, people from other parts of Ecuador would come down to this area and squat. They became squatters, non-indigenous people, and they would farm the land. So there was an influx of people on the back of the oil development that created the population that lives down there now. Now, the pollution affects indigenous and non-indigenous people alike. And one of the distinguishing features of our campaign and our lawsuit is that the indigenous and non-indigenous people have combined into one group for the purpose of holding Chevron accountable for this atrocity.
That's not really a common thing down there.
No, it's not. I mean, look, When I got there in the early 90s, there were some resentments because the indigenous people felt not only violated by Texaco, now Chevron, but they also felt encroached upon by non-indigenous people who were like taking advantage of the oil infrastructure development to move to this region and basically live and farm indigenous land. But you need to understand the indigenous peoples don't have a capitalist system.
Right.
Okay. And what does that mean? They just sort of had an understanding that the forest was theirs. They never marked it with a fence. They never got land title as we understand land title in a capitalist economy. So if one were to come down who's non-indigenous and sort of take a plot of land and get title to it, they're essentially stealing indigenous land. And the indigenous people, in my experience, at least back then, didn't think in terms of, personal acquisition of property or money. It was all very collective oriented. And I think it made them vulnerable to companies like Texaco, now Chevron, to come in and just take over their stuff without telling them. So in any event, it ended up over time becoming an absolutely awful environmental disaster. We think it's the worst oil disaster in the world. It's called the Amazon Chernobyl by many experts.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And what's different about it from other oil disasters people might have heard of, like the Exxon Valdez in Alaska or the Deepwater Horizon BP disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, is this was done incrementally and deliberately over many years. It was not a function of one spectacular event that got a lot of news attention. It was a function of a deliberate policy to pollute in order to save money, but over time it created something far worse. Not that I like to compare disasters. I know they're all bad, but far worse than any of those disasters. I mean, this is 100 plus times the size of the Exxon Valdez disaster.
Well, what's crazy is you started on this 31 years ago in 93, but when you get there in 93, according to what you told me, it's been going on for 26 years.
Yes.
So what I want to know is, where's the Ecuadorian government 10 years into that, 5 years into that, 15 years into that? Why does it take a group of 15 people on basically like a missionary trip, so to speak, in a way, coming down here saying something's wrong for people to start do something about it?
Well, first of all, the role of the Ecuadorian government is interesting, and it's a little complicated. First of all, at the time Texaco, now Chevron, first went in there in the 60s, there was a military government. Ecuador did not have an elected government.
Okay.
So the army, the military in Ecuador cut the deal to do this. And by the way, Texaco, Chevron, a lot of these big oil companies love working with sort of non-democratic governments because it just makes it easier and more efficient for them. And part of their original agreement is the army of Ecuador was going to provide security for them. An army that's purpose is to defend the nation was actually providing private security to a private oil company against its own people. That's what this ended up happening over the years.
They must have paid well.
Exactly. And Ecuador's government, that is the elites in Ecuador, made a lot of money out of this deal. In other words, Texaco, now Chevron, did all the production. They were the operator of all these fields because, no one in Ecuador knew how to do this. And they would then sell the oil and pay a percentage to Ecuador's government for the right to operate down there. Ecuador's government negotiated some really bad deals and could have made a lot more money, but that was the arrangement for many, many years. And then when Chevron left, and I'm just going to call it Chevron for purposes of ease here, when they left in 1992, Ecuador by then had developed enough expertise to have its own state oil company called Petro Ecuador, and they took over the entire operation and kept polluting.
Oh, so Chevron completely pulled out, and then Ecuador
took it over. Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So when you get down there, that's what's happening, because you're there in 93.
Exactly. But understand that our lawsuit is only against Texaco, now Chevron.
Yeah, because they built it.
Because they built it, they were exclusive operator,
Right.
They designed it, they engineered a system to pollute, and they are the ones really responsible. Now, when Ecuador took it over, they just kept operating it for the most part in the same way that Texaco had taught them to, And by the way, they have sued Petro Ecuador, Chevron has, as a way to what's called implead them, to try to get them to pay or at least share some of the liability from our lawsuit. But under the law, if you're harmed, you're not obligated to go find every little entity that contributed to your harm. You can sue whoever you want, and that one entity is responsible for 100% of the harm. Even if some of it was caused by other companies, they are then responsible if they feel other companies should share the burden to sue them. So it's a way to not require the victim of what's called a tort or some sort of harmful act to have to like figure out who was involved. You can just sue one entity.
But is that the case in both U.S. law and Ecuadorian law? That's going to be important later.
Yes.
It's the same?
Yes.
Okay. Hey guys, if you have a second, please be sure to share this episode around on social media and with your friends, whether it's Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, doesn't matter. It's all a huge help. It gets new eyeballs on the show, and it allows us to grow and survive. So thank you to all of you who have already been doing that, and thank you to all of you who are going to do so now. All right, so how long was that trip in 93 when you went down? How long were you there?
It was 7 to 10 days or so. I don't remember exactly.
By the time you left, did you grasp maybe not that this was going to be a 30-year odyssey, but did you grasp that this was going to become a main focus that was going to be a tough battle for you, or was it still preliminary, like, okay, this is a disaster, let's see how we're going to help and figure it out from there?
It was more the latter. I mean, look, the trip ended up changing my life in profound ways, but at the time I didn't know how that would play out or even if it would happen. So like after that first trip, I was appalled. Like the others on the trip, we wanted to do something to help the people and to hold Chevron accountable. So when we got back, we decided to do a lawsuit, and we organized a legal team, got some funding. I was very young at the time. I hadn't practiced law for more than a year, and there were others involved who had much more experience than I as lawyers, and we hooked up with them, and we designed a case and, wrote up a lawsuit and filed it, I think, about 6 months after this trip. It's pretty fast.
Where'd you file it?
We filed it right here in New York City in Manhattan.
Okay.
And the reason we filed it, by the way, in New York City, if people understand, is that Texaco's headquarters at the time, remember Chevron did not buy Texaco until 2001.
Yep.
We filed this in 1993. So at that time, Texaco's headquarters were right here in New York, in actually White Plains, New York, right nearby Manhattan. And like the goal of the people of Ecuador who were affected was like, let's file it in the United States where they are. I mean, all the decisions to pollute in Ecuador were made here in New York. I mean, that's kind of one of the ironies of this. So while the problem manifested in Ecuador, the actual crime or the wrongdoing happened here.
Yeah.
And also the people of Ecuador didn't trust their own legal system at the time. In other words,
I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, here's a company that had been dumping openly, systematically, methodically with impunity for, 25 plus years, and they didn't have to pay $1 in damages. There wasn't a single case. So they're like, let's sue them up there. And we hope to get a jury trial. And that began a whole 10-year period, that is from the early 90s to 2001, where Texaco, then Chevron, fought tenaciously to block the ability of the Ecuadorian people, the indigenous people, to get into the courthouse, to have a case done in U.S. courts, because they were absolutely terrified that a jury in the United States would find against them and order them to pay. And it would also obviously generate a lot of bad publicity. So their first line of defense was to kick the case out of U.S. courts, move it down to Ecuador, where they had operated, dumped, polluted all these years, never paid $1. So they thought by moving it to Ecuador, they could essentially obtain impunity, avoid accountability, just because of their influence over Ecuador's courts. And it didn't work out too well for them.
So I don't expect you to remember like exact numbers on stuff, but just ballparking it to give it some scope. I have a few questions about the stretch of this. Like, we saw the size of the land where they were doing this, and obviously a lot of people are affected. But like ballpark, how many quote unquote potential victims were you filing that class action on behalf of?
Okay, so when we first started, we estimated it to be 30,000 people.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah. But that was in 1993. There's been a huge population influx since then. And it's, we think it's a lot higher than that now, maybe 100,000 people.
So also at that time, and again, this might have changed too, I don't know if it was from the first trip or specifically on the research afterwards in the build up to actually filing the lawsuit, were you able to get data to show, for example, some of the carcinogenic effects on health or deaths that had happened? I mean, it had been 26 years since this started. So did you have data to already show that this had impacted the life expectancy of the region?
The answer is yes, and we got that a number of ways. One is the doctors that came down on that first trip did a lot of sampling and were able to produce independent lab results that showed high levels of cancer-causing toxins in the waters that people were drinking out of, next to these oil pits. And then also there was a doctor down there from Spain, Miguel San Sebastian, who, independent of all of our activities, was doing his own research. And he produced in the 1990s a number of reports that confirmed extremely high cancer rates in these areas where the pollution was occurring. So we had a lot of data to work with, and we also had a ton of anecdotal individual testimonies from people who lived there that they were sick. And there's also data there's a national cancer registry in Ecuador, and we had access to some of that data, which was very disturbing. But, all of this goes to say, I mean, you can't necessarily prove X person's cancer was caused by this well. It's complicated. But if you look at the overall data and saw the dramatic increase in cancer rates in this region where Chevron was operating, you see there's got to be some sort of connection. We had data to begin with that we could use to assert in the initial lawsuit that there was a real health problem caused by these reckless drilling practices.
Okay. Now we're going to take this as much in order as we can because, like we said at the outset, this is like a 30-year story, so there's a lot that happens on the way. But not to bury the lead here for people who are not familiar with your story, this ends, or at least is up to the point now where you ended up having to do basically more than 2 years on house arrest due to a contempt of court charge after a whole litany of things involving different cases that were brought against you where Chevron's money was involved in improper places within those cases. Mm-hmm. So this gets to, it starts with and continues to be the main story that we have all these victims from a completely unrepresented area pretty much that you're trying to fight for. And then it also unfortunately adds a second element to it where it's like this attack on Steve Donziger for shaking the tree to try to help these people. So back to when you first filed that lawsuit. I'm not totally familiar with all the legal processes. I hear stories all the time where a big lawsuit gets filed, it gets dismissed by a judge, or it says it's allowed to go to trial or whatever. What did the judge say right away this is allowed to go to trial? Like what was the process and how did, at the time, Texaco respond to this? What were your dealings with them at the beginning?
So, okay, this is interesting. At the very beginning in 1993 when it started, they hired a big gun law firm, corporate law firm called King & Spalding, which is based in Atlanta, specifically a former United States Attorney General under the administration of Jimmy Carter. It goes probably way before y'all's time, but I remember these years.
I know Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
He might be dead by the time this comes out, but...
In any event, Jimmy Carter had an attorney general by the name of Griffin Bell, who, after Jimmy Carter left office, became a partner in King & Spalding, this law firm. And Chevron hired Griffin Bell to lead the effort to beat back our case, which, by the way, I took as a compliment, because clearly they were taking this very seriously from the get-go. And when we filed the lawsuit on November 3rd, 1993, it was reported on the national network news on CBS with Dan Rather as the anchor. Now, that might not mean much to your audience, but back in the early 90s, really pre-internet, all people did at night from 6:30 to 7 was watch either NBC, ABC, or CBS. I mean, you can still get these shows now. They have a much lower audience. But it was.
You ever heard of those, Alessi?
Yes, I did.
You ever heard of a guy named Walter Cronkite?
Yes, actually. Look at the top picture on the far wall.
That's good. I mean, he was the closest thing to God in America for many years when I was growing up. But in any event, it was covered on CBS Evening News the day it was filed, and it immediately sent shockwaves through the fossil fuel industry, through Texaco, that a group of indigenous people could somehow hook up with, lawyers in the United States who knew what they were doing to file a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit for damages over pollution caused in Ecuador that Texaco never thought anyone would even think about. at the time they did it. So I think it sent shockwaves, and they responded with a tremendous amount of hostility and investment of resources and lawyers to try to get the case dismissed.
Now, what's your role on this? You're one of the attorneys filing it, but like, how many of you guys did it? Did you have a main law firm behind it? Because you're very early in your career at this point, as you said.
And also I had another job. I was working full-time as a public defender representing juveniles accused of crimes in Washington, D.C. So I did this on my vacation and my spare time. So the reality was I was a very kind of subordinate, low-level player on the legal team. There were more experienced lawyers, but I was definitely on signing as a lawyer on the original lawsuit. I think I was one of 3 or 5 people at the time, and I'm literally the only one left working on it from that original group of lawyers.
Like alive or practicing?
Well,
sorry.
Well, I will say I'm the only one left still trying to help the people of Ecuador, and I think everyone is still alive.
That's good.
Some maybe a little less so than others, but I think everyone is still alive.
I'm a podcaster. I don't have class sometimes. I'm sorry. All right. So you get that filed, and what's the next process? Did you go in and have like a giant hearing against this law firm from Atlanta, but with the former attorney general, or how did it go?
Yeah. So when a case, this is a civil case, not a criminal case, meaning you're suing for money over damages. So the first thing they try to do, and what any corporate defendant usually tries to do, is get it dismissed, claiming there's no case, or the legal claims are invalid, or there's no jurisdiction. There's all sorts of defenses you can put up at the very beginning to try to get a case dismissed. That process of litigating those issues can take quite a long time, and if they're complicated. And it was very clear from the beginning that Texaco or Chevron's strategy was to just make it as complicated as possible, because they had a lot of money and they knew we didn't. And the harder it is to deal with responding to all these issues, the more our scarce resources get used up. And the idea is to really intimidate us into really not going forward, or maybe to settle the case for a very low amount. So, getting through that initial period requires quite a lot of dedication and work, which we got through it, and we actually got into what's called the discovery process, meaning we're entitled to get information from them. They give us documents. We give them documents. And just getting into discovery without a dismissal was a huge victory for the people of Ecuador, because it required Chevron to give us, thousands and thousands of pages of their internal files related to the Ecuador case, and like what the history was and when they started, and did they do any internal tests for pollution that they never disclosed? Did they design the system to pollute? I mean, we got all sorts of incredible material through that process, including a famous memo where they basically ordered all internal documents related to pollution and pipeline spills to be destroyed. I mean, they basically were
what year was that?
This was in.
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
That's okay. This was in, I don't know, like they had started really building this out in the 70s in a big way. I think this was in the late 70s, early 80s when like their pollution started to attract attention, through the media. They're like, destroy all the documents.
So long before they left Ecuador.
Yeah. I mean, they knew as they were doing this that it was not right. Let's be honest. I mean, you could just see it with your own eyes, and they were, and probably in their own minds are like, well, let's just do it on the cheap. There's no one down here to complain about it. These people have no money. They'll never figure out how to sue us. And what's the big deal? There's hardly anyone out here anyway. And by the way, there's a lot of racism in there too, because
you don't say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this whole colonialist mentality, like the indigenous people just didn't count in their eyes. They weren't really people. They were, you look at some of their documents, they regarded them as savages. I mean, they're the most.
Did they ever call them that?
They're the most peaceful people imaginable, who really live harmoniously with the environment. I mean, now as I look at the climate crisis, I consider them the frontline defenders of the planet. They are. Like, they take care of nature for the rest of us who are not indigenous. Texaco, Chevron regarded them as a bunch of savages. Yeah, I mean, they treated them, just to give you an example, they would, so, when they started to dump this stuff into rivers and streams, like the local indigenous people were like, what the fuck is this? Excuse my language. They'd
You're
go,
okay.
Yeah, I figured I might be in this podcast. they go to the Texaco engineers. They're like, what's this black stuff on our streams? They're like, oh, that's oil. Don't worry about it. It's good for you.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's good for you. It's medicinal.
They said that to them.
Rub it on your head. It will help improve your health. It's medicinal. It's like milk. It has vitamins. But I mean, look, you hear these stories, and I heard this directly from people who are now older, this was back in the early 90s, but had these types of conversations with the engineers from Texaco. And they would just mock the people. I mean, that's a mockery. Okay?
Of course it is.
And that's an indication of how they looked at the indigenous people as inferior, not equal to them, people to be made fun of, to be abused. And, it was really the kind of mentality it takes to go into someone else's land and just dump billions of gallons of cancer-causing waste in a way that is going to kill a lot of people. Think about it.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
I mean, I actually, none of it surprises me or anything, but some of the history, particularly in the 20th century, which I think correctly, is like not long ago, I was very unaware of it. When Paul was in here for the first time, he talked to me all about the rubber boom, which now I've looked into extensively with Henry Ford.
Right.
And like people wonder why some of these uncontacted tribes shoot on sight when someone comes in there.
Yeah.
I'm like, I get that,
right.
Because it's not even, they not only treated these people like savages, they killed them.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about here is like a mockery, as you said, slow kill, but they're just taking advantage of people for maybe a lack of understanding of things that are in the modern world. But in reality, those people know a lot more about the earth than we do in this world that we take for granted.
Very true. And I would caution people not to assume that the modern world is better than their world.
Right.
It's an open question to me. I went down there as a young lawyer thinking I would teach them about the law and about how to do a case and, hold Chevron accountable. And I was very anxious to be successful. And it's my first big case and, to help people. I was aggressive and probably arrogant to some degree. I came out of Harvard Law School as a young man. Where at Harvard, they trained you to be a leader of the world, And I realized over time, though, that I got very humbled down there. I mean, these people with seemingly nothing that we value in the United States or in the North, they have no money. They have very few clothes. Their houses are made of wood, thatched roof huts often, and they don't go to grocery stores. They actually hunt their animals and fish for their food. And I realized over time that I learned so much more about life than they ever learned from me about law. I mean, life from them than they ever learned from me about law. And it's just very humbling. I mean, I've lost a lot, by the way, through this materially.
Yeah.
But I've lived a very rich life, and I feel very blessed to have had these experiences that I'm talking about now. But it's just people don't understand here, generally, that you can be rich and not have money. I mean, you can be, the people of the Amazon, before oil came and before these outside extractive industries showed up, lived very prosperous, happy lives and never had money. And my son, I once went to his elementary school to talk about the case. And the first thing I asked the kids was it's fifth or sixth grade. I'm like, can you imagine being rich and having no money? And it was everyone looked at me dumbfounded. They couldn't figure out how you could be rich and have no money because there's such a conflation of wealth with money in our culture. And they have the indigenous peoples of Ecuador, the Amazon, and many places around the world have a totally different conception of wealth than we do.
Well, money is just a story at the end of the day. It's a story told by, men and women to other men and women who come after them, that this is the thing that we exchange that tells you what you're worth in this society. So if you live in a society that just didn't ever use maybe that paper currency or metallic currency to trade around and perhaps valued other things that sometimes weren't even material. They could be spiritual and things like that. And you lived in these communities where you relied on each other to survive as well in very difficult environments. You know, it would make a lot of sense to me how, you know, people feel the wealth of the human spirit in a way. It's just not. I understand though why 5th and 6th graders, I know I would have been one of them, would look at you like you have 10 fucking heads when you say that, because they're just trained from a young age. You know, they watch mommy and daddy use cash or a credit card to get gas or do whatever, and that's how they get what they get. It's not just this magic thing that pops into your pocket, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
It's fascinating to me that, you know, you can look back on it now though and see all the work you've done on it and the emotion you've piled into this, because that comes across to this day. Like when people, I'll direct people to your Instagram as well in link in description, but when people can watch you talk on Instagram, in particularly about this case, the passion literally comes through the keyboard when it's just you typing out, you know, the post. But for you to see all these people who in many ways to this day have never been paid because of what happened that we're going to get to as a result of this case, but to see them kind of like take you in as one of them in a way who's fighting for them and it's so clear the appreciation many of these people have to this day for you. There's something that is to me a current happy ending in that story, even if justice hasn't been done. I hope you can see that on your end as well.
Well, I appreciate you saying that and seeing it. You know, look, I don't think of it as a happy ending because there's so many people suffering. But I will say this, the hard work that I and others put in over many, many years has produced some incredibly positive benefits to the world, to the people of Ecuador, even if the cleanup has not happened yet.
Guys, if you're still watching this video and you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please take 2 seconds and go hit it right now. Thank you.
And I would say one of the main positive benefits is the fact that we created a model of organizing at the most grassroots level possible in the world. You know, with these really vulnerable communities in the Amazon, we're able to deliver to them the benefit of a lot of sophisticated lawyers and legal talent and backers, donors, funders, people who wanted to help them. And we created a team, an international team that had an enormous impact and still is having an impact because the case is still going on. And, you know, I think the assumption Texaco and Chevron always have made is that these people will never be able to fight back, will never be able to hold them accountable. And we completely changed that with this model we created, not only a model of people, you know, cross-border international cooperation, people from totally different backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, different places, different ways of thinking about the world, brought it all together and raised a lot of money to fund the litigation, because you can't just do a litigation without money. You need money to pay experts, to pay expenses. I took 250 trips to Ecuador, had to buy plane tickets.
How'd you raise this money?
Just any way I could. I mean, basically, I went to, the first part of the case was funded by a plaintiff's law firm in Philadelphia.
What firm?
Cohn, Swift, and Graff. I don't know if you've heard of them.
My dad has practiced out of Philly for a long time.
Yeah, he's probably heard of them. They're well known.
He probably knows them.
They're a small but, you know, profitable class action lawsuit firm, and they're good people. And they took this on. So remember I said we took that first trip, came back, filed the lawsuit. They were the law firm that we then went to join our team to file it. And they ended up doing a lot of the financing of the case for many, many years. But over time, you know, Chevron started to make things so intense, so complicated. They started filing all these other cases to attack the original case.
Like how? What do you mean? Like
well, what I mean is, the fundamentals of the story. Let me just cut to the chase about what happened. So, you know, we filed here in the U.S. That period of the case took 10 years, and they got it shifted to Ecuador's courts because they wanted impunity and they didn't want to have a trial in the United States with the jury.
Are you in discovery for 10 years? Is that what you're saying? Or?
In discovery, no, but then we had to litigate the issue where the trial should be. And they, you know, they're tactic always is to drag things out as long as they
Right.
can. So, the courts move slowly. You see that now with all these cases against Donald Trump. I mean, like, it just takes a long time to get to trial, usually.
That's your judge too, right? You were telling me?
Yeah, Lou Kaplan. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. In any event, it took a while, but eventually that first 10-year period ended, and they won that phase of the battle to some degree. But like I'm kind of an intuitive person, and like I didn't feel they really won it, because I realized what we won out of that phase is they had to accept jurisdiction in Ecuador's courts as a condition of a U.S. judge sending the case from U.S. courts to Ecuador. Had we initially filed in Ecuador, they would have never accepted jurisdiction, would have challenged it. So when we then refiled the case in Ecuador, which is what I would call phase 2 of this long litigation.
What year are we in?
This was in
06?
2003. Okay, 10 years in. We had them. Like, there was going to be a trial. And when you're a big oil company and you're sued by indigenous people, your first goal is to not have a trial. I mean, get rid of the case. So the fact we were able to relatively quickly, once it got moved to Ecuador, okay, we were in a trial 6 months after we refiled the case in Ecuador. That's fast. Okay, we had them in a trial. And
but they tried to get it moved back, right? Like right away?
But they thought we would go away. In other words, the case being financed by U.S. lawyers. U.S. lawyers can't practice in Ecuador. We had to then go down there, find Ecuadorian lawyers to do it, pay them. It just becomes a lot more complicated. So their strategy by moving it to another country was we would give up. That was their first strategy. But when we didn't give up, showed up with Ecuadorian lawyers, we made a trial happen, and that was an enormous victory, a trial where they were forced to submit to the jurisdiction of a court in Ecuador with judges who, came from the region, who understood the problem, and suddenly the entire dynamic shifted in a way that, I'm like, wow, we could probably have a fair trial here, and the people felt that too. So by seeking to move it down to Ecuador, they, I understand what they were trying to do at the time, but I think there was also a big silver lining to us losing that phase of the battle.
Going back to that 10 years though, getting it pushed there, one of the things that I'm always wondering that I think a lot of people out there, those of us who aren't attorneys, get a little confused by is we know this concept of the powerful will just try to drag it out in court so that you go away, meaning they spend more money, meaning you have to spend more money, they can afford it, you can't. Plain and simple. But can you just give us an example of how they can get an argument over where the jurisdiction is can drag out across, I don't know, maybe hundreds of hearings or something across 10 years? Like, to me, layman sitting at home, I'd be like, okay, there's going to be a hearing on, is it going to be there or here? Maybe at that hearing they say, okay, we need discovery for that. Okay, we get one more hearing, we go there, discovery's there, we present the case and it's decided. But that's not how it goes. Like, how would they go in and be raising a new point to say, oh, we got to get another hearing?
So the answer to that is there's not 100 hearings. There's maybe 10 hearings over 10 years. And the real delays are when they're able to take a preliminary issue like jurisdiction, and a trial judge rules, okay, there's jurisdiction or there's not jurisdiction, and the losing party then appeals. In other words, prior to any trial, you're appealing these pretrial motions decisions to a higher court. You got to write appellate briefs, and you have argument over that. It can take a really long time, and it's ridiculous, actually, how long it takes. But because the system is so slow, even in a normal case, corporations that are well-funded know this, so they often use the slowness of the system as a way to grind down those of us who bring these social justice, environmental justice cases, as a way to sort of discourage us or make us run out of money, and to really win through procedural hijinks, procedural subterfuge, what they can never win on the claims. In other words, they can't win the claims. I mean, we are right, they are wrong. A court, this case,
Sure.
We won this case. But their hope at that time was we would get so discouraged by the procedural burden of having to keep fighting just to get to trial that we would give up.
Were you having, after the initial case gets filed, and you mentioned it got onto Dan Rather, maybe some of the other channels too, as the case went on, did you start already to find it harder for the media to cover this and get suspicious about the potential relationship between Chevron and advertiser and the media, or did that part come later in the case?
That part came a little later. Okay, in the 90s, there wasn't a ton of press coverage. There was some, and it was usually pretty sympathetic to us. I mean, you were like, wow, this is unbelievable. I can't believe what they did down there. But again, part of the reason they felt they could get away with it is the place was so isolated. It was very hard to travel to and see it, and very few journalists, if any, actually went there. And I think they counted on that in their analysis. You know, they're like, well, this is kind of a very isolated area. We could probably get away with this here. Or even as they litigated, like, people are not going to pay that much attention to this. There might be an article here or there. I'd say the press coverage really started to kick into gear when we got them into trial in the early 2000s. Be like, wow, there's a trial. And I remember the very first day of the trial in October of 2003.
In Ecuador.
In Ecuador, in that little town of Lago Agrio, Cofán territory. Town that did not have a paved road or a stoplight. Okay. There were journalists there from, at the time, were the Big Four, which was the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and LA Times. People might not remember, but like those were the Big Four newspapers in the U.S.
Yeah.
And they still are to some degree, although the LA Times is like, a shadow of its former self and, whatever. But there was a lot of media coverage at the beginning of the trial in the Ecuador phase, which is what I would call phase 2, which lasted from 2003 to 2011 when we won the case in the trial court. It took 8-9 years. Yeah. Because they did the same BS in Ecuador, the Ecuador trial that they did in the first phase, the 10-year phase in the U.S., which is they tried to drag it out as much as they could. They, requested all these field inspections that were just redundant. They filed literally dozens of motions, in an hour just to tie up the judge. And Ecuador's courts don't have the resources of U.S. courts. Like they move a little more slowly. And they took advantage of that because, the main advantage they had over us was resource. They had money and they were willing to spend it, and they knew we had very little. So, they would, and this has always been their strategy until it's not that relevant at this point because we won. But for years, their strategy was to, use their money to pay a bunch of lawyers to sort of throw, sand into the gears of the justice system so it would go on for as long as possible because they would rather pay lawyers to just litigate than have a final decision that would likely go against them. And that was their strategy.
Now, this being an Ecuadorian court, though, obviously you're involved with the case. The counter attorneys from the U.S. are involved with the case, but you guys, I would assume, have to have like lead Ecuadorian counsel down there, right?
Yeah.
So how would you describe, like from a layman's standpoint, how would you describe that role? Are you making the case behind the scenes and then they're putting it in court and arguing it, or is it a collaboration? How did it work?
I would say it was a true collaboration. I mean, basically, they know their system. And by the way, Ecuador has a different legal system than the U.S. system in many respects. It's what's called a civil law system, and we have a common law system. So people, little quick law lesson, if I
Please.
may. We come out of the British tradition, which is like the Commonwealth tradition, the Great Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States, basically the places Britain colonized. And then a lot of the rest of the world has a civil system which has its origin in the Spanish legal system. And the places Spain colonized, Latin America, Louisiana, actually in the United States, the French also were into this, have a totally different kind of system that's more judge-centered versus, I would say lawyer-centered, which is ours. In a civil system, the judge has an enormous amount of power. There's generally not a jury. In the common law system, the lawyers have a ton of power, and there's usually a jury. Judges always have a certain amount of power, but they're very different systems designed for the same purpose, which is to sort of adjudicate conflicts fairly, right. Find the facts, find the truth. But we were not qualified as American lawyers, and we're not allowed to practice law in Ecuador. So we were able to take our expertise about science, about expert reports, about how to battle this out in the media, and also we could look at Ecuador's laws and sort of, work with our local lawyers on strategy. But, one of the satisfying things about the experience is the Ecuadorian lawyers who worked on our case, mostly Pablo Fajardo, Juan Pablo Sanchez, and Julio Prieto did a great job really pushing this in a way that over time they really led this. And they did a great job. I mean, we financed it. We were able to get experts on science and oil, contamination from the United States to help. But they were really the lead lawyers during the case in Ecuador.
Is that hard with the expert side of things? This is always something that's interesting to me because, like, you can go to websites of guys who make a living off of being a legal expert on something that they're an expert on, and then you'll see the cases they work. And it'll be, and I think in some ways this is good, by the way, but it'll be cases on a certain type of issue where they take the opposite side depending on who hires them, right? So not the same cases, but maybe the same family of types of cases. And so what I always wonder is there a piece of, like, are you competing with some capitalism here on both sides where it's like, okay, well, you hire this expert, you're paying them, they're happy to be paid, they want to help you out, they're hiring that expert, they're paying them, they're probably even more happy to be paid, but a lot more, and they're helping them out, and then that kind of, you have trouble getting to the actual truth of that?
Well, it's a good question. In U.S. courts, and there's an issue that experts need to opine on for a jury or a judge, both sides hire their own expert. They pay them, and they produce usually opposite conclusions,
right.
And the jury has to assess them as witnesses, like who has more credibility, who seems to be doing a better job, who's right, who's wrong, that kind of stuff. So it's a battle where both sides control their own experts. In a civil law system like the one in Ecuador, often the judge will appoint the expert.
Oh.
And there's only one expert. But that has its own set of problems for various reasons because, it's not, adversarial as much, and you don't really get 2 points of view. In our case in Ecuador, the judge actually adopted the U.S. system, and both Chevron and our side used our own experts on all these site visits. So the judge had the benefit of two separate expert views of stuff under the control of the parties. But, yeah, I mean, if a party hires an expert and pays him or her, they expect the report to come out a certain way, and you could argue, well, that's not science, that's not truth, that's not objective. But the reality is juries are not dumb. Like, they can look at these reports and look at the testimony and assess it for themselves, and they often come to, I think, really good conclusions.
Okay. So you guys are pulling all these experts during this 8-year trial. I don't even know how it lasts that long. But that's crazy. Years. Did you also get to bring in witnesses, like some of the people?
Yeah, so the way it worked is, the reason it lasted 8 years is because in Ecuador, the civil law system, you don't see this in the U.S., a lot of the trial consisted of the parties going to these polluted sites, these well sites with all these pits, and taking water and soil samples in front of the judge and taking witness testimony from people who lived around the pits. And each of these are called inspections. Site inspections, and we would do, the weeks we would do this, and it was like once a month we'd go out for 2 days. And Chevron sort of saw this as an opportunity to delay and sabotage the trial. They basically asked for dozens and dozens of these inspections, and they're expensive to do. You have to pay people to go, and you pay for lab tests and stuff. And over time, every inspection showed the same thing, like massive pollution, like incredibly high rates of total petroleum hydrocarbons and other harmful chemicals, in these sites that were clearly cancer-causing. So after a certain time, we asked the judge, we don't need to keep doing this. Every single one of these sites shows the same results. Texaco, now Chevron, caused a massive environmental disaster that's harming the environment and putting out substances that kill people if they're ingested. We don't need to continue the trial because they were using these inspections to keep delaying the final result, the final resolution.
Was their side trying to find stuff different and saying, look, it's not that bad?
They were using junk science, yes. I mean, I noticed this constantly. For example, if there's a pit in a certain location, we would go sample in the pit or right next to the pit to show the pollution. They would look at the pit and they would walk up a little hill, like 200 yards, and take a sample up there to quote unquote prove that the pollution hadn't spread. Oh, this is clean. It's no big deal. The pit isn't harming anyone. It hasn't really spread. I mean,
it's in the water, though.
Yeah. No, it is in the water, but they're not sampling where they think they're going to find it. I mean, they would send their teams out the day before, the week before these planned inspections, and they would sample the site secretly to figure out when the judge shows up where they could sample that would in places that would not produce results. They would sample secretly, like get these really bad results. We know this because we ended up getting this information of their secret sampling. And then when the judge would come, they would commit, in my opinion, fraud. They would basically go sample in places where they knew there was not contamination as a way to try to deceive the court into thinking they hadn't caused any harm. I mean,
my God.
This is the kind of crap we had to deal with constantly. You know, this effort to sabotage the trial, or to the extent they had to report sampling results, they tried to report deceptive sampling results.
How was the media coverage developing during all this, though? Because you mentioned at the very beginning you had the Big Four sitting there in the trial. But over this 8-year period, did they start to move away and not cover it, or did they continue reporting on it in the U.S.?
There was sporadic reporting. I would say that it was difficult to get sustained interest just because the case was going on so long and people were like, what, you know, I've covered that already. Let me know when there's a result, that kind of stuff. But as it developed, more and more people started to realize there was something really special happening. Like it was just unique, and I think it had never happened before, unprecedented, to have indigenous peoples go toe-to-toe in court with an American oil company to this extent. I mean, it was very interesting visually and just for a variety of reasons, since it had never happened before. Like people were like, wow, I wonder if these people can really hold this oil company accountable. Interesting that lawyers from the United States are down there, you know. So we got, magazine coverage. I'd say a big, important sort of pivot point was when Vanity Fair went down and did a big story on the case and on Pablo Fajardo, who was a lead Ecuadorian lawyer.
Can we find that, Alessi?
Yeah, it's called, I think it's called Amazon Crude or Crude. And it was on, Vanity Fair had an environmental issue they put out every year, and Leonardo DiCaprio was on the cover. I remember this well, standing on an iceberg in Greenland. And in that issue was this probably 15,000 word article on our case, and it really put us on the map. And suddenly all these people, like 60 Minutes then did a piece off of that, came down.
Were you in that?
I was, yeah. 60 Minutes did a piece. It's hard to find, though, because Chevron convinced them to take it down from their site. I mean, we have a copy. Yeah. Chevron.
So it's like not on YouTube.
It's hard to find. It's here and there, pieces of it, but it was really powerful. It came out in May of 2009, as the case was ending in Ecuador, and it made them look terrible. I mean, it really captured the extent of the pollution, the intentionality, the lack of concern for the people, the lies. There are a lot of lies around these pits. They would tell journalists that they didn't harm anybody. And by that time, we had so much evidence from laboratories that they had massive amounts of cancer-causing substances that their lies began to fall apart. They began to collapse. And I think they got increasingly desperate. One of the things they did is they paid a man named Diego Borja, who worked on their team, this Ecuadorian guy, to go undercover and meet with the judge, he and this other American guy named Wayne Hansen, and they acted like they were cleanup experts. And they're like, "Oh, where's this case going? Yeah, we want business if the ruling is in favor of the communities. We want to see if we can do the cleanup, and we have a company." They lied to the judge, and they taped it without telling him through a pen. And
to make it look like
oh my God. And it was crazy. They took these tapes to the New York Times and got totally manipulated by, I'll explain how in a second. And they got like a story saying, it looks like the case is corrupt. This is like right before it ended.
Wait, this isn't Judge Guerra, is it?
No, it's another judge.
Different judge. Okay.
Another judge. Judge forget his name now.
Okay.
But there were in Ecuador, the judges rotate every 2 years on a case because these cases can last years. So in the case we brought, since it was such an important case under a certain environmental law, they anticipated some of these cases could last a long time. So they had a rule that only the president of the court could preside over this case. And there were 4 judges on the court, and they would rotate the presidency. So they would they all presided over the case. They all knew about the case. I mean, it wasn't that big a deal. It was just the way Ecuadorian law worked.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.